Here now, we present an abridged version of the evening's panel. The event can be heard in its entirety, in quality audio and video, through Wolf's Facebook page, and we highly recommend listening to the entire panel. I tried to include speaker highlights, but everything these women say is relevant and important. Everything. Really. A quick note, there are male voices in the following segment. Before we go into the venue, I want to mention that there was quite a bit of protests for this event. You'll hear some of the speakers mention that a police escort was required to enter the building on account of dozens of protesters surrounding the main entrance. Inside, the event begins on schedule. A Seattle Public Library representative welcomes everyone and explains that interruptions won't be tolerated. Lierre Keith begins speaking.
You all rock. Okay. So we just have a few thank yous first. Number one, of course, is the Seattle Public Library. And in particular, really. Sorry. Oh, for fuck's sake. Everybody just stay down. Calm, it's all fine, just stay calm. They're gonna handle it.
This goes on for about 30 seconds before women lose their patience, and the library representative again addresses the audience.
Everyone, like I stated before, disruptive behavior is not allowed. Okay. Hey.
After which the protesters continue to be disruptive for 2.5 more minutes. Eventually, the women's voices rise and overwhelm the gender identity protesters. Once more, the library representative attempts to regain the room and is again met with disruption.
Okay, everyone. Everyone in the auditorium has received their warning for disruptive behavior.
After this, it is assumed the last of the disruptive protesters has been escorted out by the Seattle PD, and Lierre Keith is able to continue the talk she began 8 minutes previously.
So, to my list of thank yous, I am now going to add the Seattle Police Department. There's a reason the First Amendment is first. For democracy to work, people need to be able to gather and they need to be able to speak. It really is that simple. In 1968, the poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." Propelled by collective pain and inchoate rage, women like my mother found the words, saw the pattern, called it political, created theory, and built a movement to liberate women. And the world did split open. A short history of feminist accomplishments: rape crisis hotlines, battered women's shelters, abortion and birth control on demand, sexual harassment laws, equal funding for girls' sports, a storming of the barricades in the trades and professions, and a flowering of lesbian culture. We are now supposed to sneer at them for knowing that women are women. But it was exactly that knowing that let them change the world. We owe them everything. If you had told me 20 years ago that one day I would not be able to speak in public unless surrounded by a phalanx of armed men, I would not have believed you. We expected authoritarianism from the right. We weren't prepared for it from the left. A brief catalog of what the left is doing. Women have lost their jobs. They've lost their publishers. They've lost custody of their kids. They've been threatened so badly they've had to move, and they've been physically assaulted. The most basic facts of biology are now considered a hate crime, which means the reality of women's lives are back to being unspeakable. Children's bodies, especially their future fertility and sexual function, are being destroyed permanently. The worst part is that no one believes us. Civic institutions that were built as bulwark against power are crumbling. Journalists are afraid of losing their jobs. And if that doesn't chill you, nothing will. Academia has fallen, though Hogwarts still stands. And people I counted as friends and comrades just want to keep their heads down so they can keep their jobs, hoping that the fever will break because this can't go on. It can, that's the thing. It can get worse. I'll end with my favorite words from, of course, Andrea Dworkin. Remember, resist, do not comply. So it is my great honor to introduce 3 other women who will not comply. First up is the incomparable Meghan Murphy.
We have always had to force our voices into the public realm, to demand to be heard, and to demand our rights. And despite all the progress we thought we'd made, now is unfortunately no different. Despite endless claims online that we're funded by evil right-wing institutions and that we're all getting rich off of all of this, that we're somehow operating from a position of power and privilege rather than from the ground up, the truth is that this is the women's movement. This is the independent grassroots women's movement. The same one that's been around since the 1800s, when women had to fight tooth and nail simply to be recognized as persons and be included in public life. This is feminism, this is women's liberation, and those who are trying to stop us, to shut us down, to shut us up, to have us fired, to terrify us into silence with endless violent threats, who try to bully you all into staying home by screaming misogynist insults in your faces simply for trying to participate in a conversation about women's rights. These are the regressive, backwards, anti-feminist authoritarians. This is the backlash. This is the hate. This is the bigotry, which I like to remind people means intolerance toward those who hold different opinions from oneself. There is manipulative rhetoric and efforts to frame this backlash as progress, but it is not. It is the same woman-hating and the same efforts to force us back into the home, back into silence, and back into fear as it always has been. We are uppity women who dare speak the truth, and that is why they want to burn us at the stake. And we cannot stop saying this. We cannot stop reminding the world that this is true. We cannot stop telling and retelling history, because history repeats itself when we don't, as we are seeing today, via the so-called trans rights movement. I say so-called because I want to be clear that this isn't about trans rights. There are no rights being fought for trans people within this activism. The activists outside are not fighting to create services and safe spaces for trans-identified people. They're certainly not fighting for the children told they're trans because they like or dislike the color pink, being put on puberty blockers, hormones, and on a path to surgery and sterility. Rather, this is a fight to end women's rights, to destroy the very foundation for women's rights, and in fact, to destroy the women's movement itself. I'm not being hyperbolic. If we can't define women as adult human females and argue that women share a particular experience in this world and have experienced historical oppression due only to having been born female, there is no basis for women's rights. Vancouver Rape Relief faced a long court battle in the mid-90s, which is often misinterpreted as an effort to ensure a woman-only policy, misconstrued by anti-feminist activists as trans exclusionary, but in fact was about their right to determine their own membership. In 1995, Kimberly Nixon, a trans-identified male, filed a human rights complaint against Vancouver Rape Relief after being rejected from a training group for counselors. So when Kimberly Nixon appeared in the training group, the three women on duty took him aside and explained that the collective had a position that women are born into oppressive circumstances that shape their lives. And they explained that because Nixon didn't have those experiences, he would not be invited into the training group. That there is, and has always been, an understanding that certain conversations can be had and certain awareness can be raised around the common experiences of women and girls, and that can only happen among women. This is indeed how the second wave began, through consciousness-raising groups, through women getting together and talking about their lives and shared experiences of oppression, harassment, abuse, and other forms of sexism, and realizing, oh, it's not just me, it's all of us, and how do we change this? So within all this focus on bathrooms and the right to pee, used by trans activists as a means to diminish women's concerns and position us as cruel aggressors, refusing others basic human rights, we lose sight of the purpose of this movement, the trans rights movement, which is to destroy female solidarity, to gaslight us all into believing that victims are powerful abusers, to remove our ability to even discuss women as a class of people and therefore in needs of rights and spaces of our own, as well as, of course, to destroy any possibility of political organizing. There is nothing to organize around as feminists if there are no women, and if women don't have a particular experience historically, socially, and politically in this world. We cannot allow this conversation to continue to be reduced to predatorial men in bathrooms. In Vancouver, a trans activist and wannabe politician named Morgane Auger, Ogre if you will, headed up a campaign to pressure the city to remove funding from Vancouver Rape Relief. This wasn't actually funding for the transition house itself or for services for women, but it was for public education, which Rape Relief does for free and has for decades. They hold talks and panels and show documentaries that educate people about women's rights, the realities of marginalized women, of male violence, and of the feminist movement. They are probably one of the only organizations doing this in Canada. Auger would, of course, go after any grant he could, any funding he could for any group or organization that fails to comply with his agenda, but this particular law seems significant to me in that it attempts to stop women from gathering and speaking and learning from one another. It cuts us off from our history and from political organizing. Women have always had to fight to tell the truth. Women who spoke out were made to wear scold's bridles and paraded around the village to teach other women a lesson. You too will be shamed, ostracized, and tortured. Don't be like her, don't speak up, don't support her, or it will happen to you. Today, women like me are held up as an example, used to instill fear in other women. Us all well to think hard about what it says about the integrity and values of a person who frames the truth as hate, and whether or not these are the kinds of people we wish to lead us towards progress and emancipation.
Miss Murphy ends her segment of the panel, and someone shouts disparaging remarks at her from the audience. Miss Keith addresses the shouter, and the women rise again.
Nothing you say can touch her. Nothing.
Keith then introduces the panel's third speaker, Saba Malik. Miss Malik shares her time with an Indigenous sister who couldn't attend the panel that night, Cherry Smiley.
I'm going to speak not just on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of my sister in struggle, Cherry Smiley. So I'm going to do my bit, and then I'm going to do her bit. I thought long and hard before accepting the offer to speak on this panel. I decided finally that it was important for my voice to be part of this panel. First, because it's important to speak the truth and show solidarity with women who are risking their well-being, their reputation, and in some cases their careers to be here. And also, and this is really important, because I felt that as a woman of color, I should be here to refute the idea that believing biology is important and that a woman is an adult human female is the same as being racist. As a woman who's experienced racism personally, systemically, and systematically, I find this comparison distressing and actually really offensive. So the reason I find the charge of my beliefs vis-à-vis the protection of women's sex-based rights being the same as racism is that it's a false comparison and it completely obscures the issue. It's a false comparison to conflate 400 years of slavery, murder, rape, torture, Jim Crow, and the segregation of public spaces by whites against black people with attempts to open women's bathrooms, shelters, prisons, locker rooms, and other female-only spaces to male-born people simply on the basis that they identify as women. That apparently makes me transphobic. That word transphobe has often felt to me like the term anti-American. Both of these terms are used to fire up emotions and to shut down any kind of robust discussion. Phobia means having an unexplained fear, okay? I don't have an unexplained fear of people who identify as transgender, I don't. I have a disagreement with their definition of what gender is, okay? That's a far cry from being phobic. I'm not here to encourage violence towards anyone. I'm not here to claim that I'm better, or that I'm superior, or that I'm more evolved than anyone else. I'm here to question the idea that womanhood is something which anyone can identify into. When I think of the civil rights movement and whatever has been captured about it in writing, in film, media, pictures, etc., what I'm confronted with is images of black people being attacked by dogs, state-sanctioned violence, okay, by dogs and clubs and water hoses while they linked arms and tried to withstand the brutality of the opposition. I'm confronted with images of white adults braying abuse and screaming at the children who were picked to first desegregate schools in this country, and of those children being escorted by police and armed guards just to enter a building. So the irony, the claim of my being racist is not lost on me when I, along with the other panelists, had to be escorted tonight by police through a separate entrance because of the protest over this event, and also because of numerous threats and suggestions of harm to us personally, including a bomb threat earlier today where they had the police and the sniffer dogs and everything. I've received both rape and death threats for choosing to be here tonight. I know these other women have too. I find it interesting how the rape threats keep coming, almost as though we have some bodily characteristic that played an important part in that definition. What I don't understand is why I'm called violent when I have not threatened anyone. My disagreement with someone does not erase them. If that were true, none of us would be here. I don't like the term cis woman, but if someone calls me a cis woman, it's not violence and it doesn't erase me. I would have had to have an incredibly fragile existence for that to be true. Biological sex is important. Historically, women's biology has been the basis of our oppression since civilization reared its head. We were not oppressed because we performed womanhood in some way or wore certain clothes. We were owned by men. So our sexual and our reproductive capacities could be commodified. Women in this country were still chattel as late as the late 19th century, maybe even more. That means that they were owned by their male relatives. I mean, that literally means that they could be bought, sold, won, and lost in card games, and they were. You can look it up. So those hard-won sex-based rights are incredibly important because they are an acknowledgement that women as a class have suffered immensely at the hands of men as a class. Trans activists go beyond promoting civil rights for trans people by insisting that trans women are literally women and that as such they're entitled to unfettered access to women's spaces, sports, affirmative action slots, and more. The extremists have succeeded in injecting the trans women are women concept into all sorts of policies already adopted by sports associations, school districts, and government agencies. They're pushing for more. The Equality Act in the US Congress gives gender identity, a person's self-declaration as to whether they're male or female, regardless of biological reality, precedence over sex as a protected category in federal civil rights laws. These are enormously important decisions being made that will literally affect thousands of women and girls, and yet a robust discussion and critique of those policies is not allowed. One of my old professors sent me a message before my appearance here today. She said to me, "Courage calls to courage everywhere." I hope that's true. As I said, my sister Cherry Smiley could not be here today. She is from the Intlakupmuch Thompson tribe on her mother's side and the Navajo Diné on her father's side. And this is what she asked me to say to everyone tonight. In universities and among activists today, I often hear that pre-colonization, indigenous cultures had many genders, and transgender or two-spirit identified individuals were respected and held leadership positions. Generally, we find third, fourth, fifth genders in cultures where gender roles were very rigid already. My grandmother's historical research and also her life experience tells me that many, if not most nations, had much less rigid ideas about gender, not more. If only men knew how to hunt and hunted, what would happen if a number of men were injured or ill or died? What would happen in the middle of a tough winter when everyone needed to pitch in? It would make sense that most members of a nation, female and male, would need to know how to survive and be able to put the knowledge into practice. This would mean less rigid gender roles. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, why does it matter? It used to be this way, so it should be this way, is an impossible claim to prove. It's politically lazy, and it abandons women from historically patriarchal cultures and has been long used to justify male violence against women and girls in many cultures, including ours today. Indigenous women in Canada fought for decades for a national inquiry into murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls, and when we got that national inquiry, it became about women, girls, and the 2SL LGBTQIA communities. We were told to make sure that men who identified as 2SL LGBTQIA were included, and disproportionate amounts of time and resources and energy went into discussing everyone else but Indigenous women in our own inquiry. If the issue of male violence against Indigenous to LGBTQIA communities is as pressing as they claim, an appropriate strategy would have been to demand a separate inquiry on that issue so that it could be thoroughly examined. There are specific historical and contemporary reasons and solutions as to why women and girls, particularly Indigenous women and girls, are harmed and attacked by men. The debate around gender is important for feminists because it forms a foundation for our movement. How can we even begin to form a feminist analysis that centers women if we are pressured to believe anyone is a woman and we are told to include and prioritize men who identify as transgender women in our work? How can we fight for women and girls when we are not allowed to set our own priorities, our own boundaries in regard to our politics, our organizing, and our safety? Indigenous women who don't say and do what white people want us to say and do are being silenced. Disagree with me, challenge me, but I am allowed to say that I love and fight for women and girls. I'm allowed to say what I think, and that's what I'm going to do.
Keith introduces the evening's final speaker, Dansky, before the Q&A portion at the end of the event.
We on this panel are all capable of speaking on the topic of gender identity in a relatively measured way because we are accustomed to doing so. I put air quotes on gender identity just then, so when I use the phrase gender identity throughout the rest of this talk, please imagine air quotes around the phrase, because gender identity isn't real in any material, real-world sense. I am angry that the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence can report the following statistics regarding domestic violence in the United States. We're all familiar with these. 1 in 4 women experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and/or intimate partner stalking with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and death. 1 in 7 women have been seriously injured by an intimate partner. 1 in 10 women have been raped by an intimate partner. 1 in 4 women have been victims of severe physical violence, for example, beating, burning, or strangling by an intimate partner. These are averages, and the situation is far worse for Black women than for white women. Lesbians are routinely harassed, attacked, and beaten for the sin of being female homosexuals, and today lesbians are being told that they are hateful bigots because they refuse to acknowledge the lie of the female penis. To be clear, when any of us read or hear or speak the statistics that I read above, every single person knows exactly what is meant by the word women. Literally no one is confused by this. And yet we have been told that we are not permitted to fight for women and girls as women and girls. Everything that women have fought for is being annihilated by gender identity in the law. As many of us know, the question of what the word sex means is currently before the United States Supreme Court in a case called Harris versus EEOC, which involves a man named Amy Stevens who is demanding legal recognition to be female. If the Supreme Court decides that Stevens is literally a woman, then women will be obliterated as a category worthy of civil rights protection in the United States, and centuries' worth of work will be undone. It's as simple as that. The Women's Liberation Front has filed a friend of the court brief in the case, arguing that sex stereotyping in employment constitutes unlawful sex discrimination and opposing employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. We expect to hear this spring or summer whether the Supreme Court thinks that women are allowed to exist in the law. Incidentally, Congress is also considering a bill called the Fairness for All Act as an alternative to the Equality Act. Like the Equality Act, it would replace the legal category of sex with gender identity, but crucially, it would exempt religious institutions. What this would mean in practice is that religious institutions would be able to maintain sex-segregated spaces, but public institutions such as public schools would not. It essentially encourages the idea that religious women and girls are entitled to sex-segregated spaces, but other women and girls are not. The Fairness for All Act would also give religious institutions a legal excuse to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, which Wolf adamantly opposes. The men in power, for thousands of years, enacted countless laws with the deliberate intention of keeping women out of power and out of civil society purely on the basis of sex. And now, at the altar of gender identity, we are expected to simply pretend that sex does not exist. No. If there are any lawmakers out there listening, please take note. There is simply no such thing as transgender. Gender is a caste system designed to keep women in our place and must be abolished, not enshrined in the law. Women are female, men are male. It's not complicated. This is the new misogyny. It's the same as the old misogyny, but with a postmodern twist. Only men could oppress women for thousands of years and then turn around, put on a dress, and claim to be the most marginalized group in society.
This is WLRN.
WLRN. Women's Liberation Radio News.
Women's Liberation Radio News.
Women's Liberation Radio News.